But go through the chapter, look at these examples. Some of them are easier to see than others. The example on page 202, that's pretty easy to see that that's a grid. It's squares broken up on a page, and they've just kind of added information in these squares and created columns of text and columns with imagery and all this kind of things. Others are a little bit harder to see. It's harder to see the grid, especially if it's just an image and a couple words, like a lot of advertisements. There's an example of a newspaper on here and some other grid layouts, and it gives you some examples of what a grid would look like with different squares, different size squares, different numbers of columns and rows. They've got fancy names for all this stuff, but you don't really need to know that. You just need to understand the grid concept, and it starts to show you how you can use these in a layout. Let's see. On page 212 at the bottom, it starts to show how you can use the grid to lay out. You can have your headline span a certain number of squares. You could have the subhead span a certain number of squares over here in a column. And then you can have your text in a different column. And you can see how versatile it is. It doesn't have to be just columns, columns, squares, squares. But that's just kind of the underlying structure to it. And then there's some other really cool examples on 214 and 215 of these really inventive spreads based on, and a lot of times the grid, it plays off the image. Like these, they're very dynamic imagery, and so they've used the text columns to kind of accentuate the imagery that you're seeing, but it's still all part of the grid. There's some other examples on 214 and 215 of other ways how you create different numbers of columns, and you can have a picture spread across 2 columns, or across the whole page, or a third of the page. It's just a really useful way to kind of get started, and it talks about breaking the grid too, if there are things that you want to accentuate, like we talked about. So that's a real short summary of the grid and how we want to do this. But I can't emphasize how important that is, and a lot of people don't think about that. It's another one of those designer things that's kind of under the radar, subconscious, where there's this underlying structure that's not maybe readily visible to other people, to the viewer, but it's there, and it helps create this sense of order, and it kind of tells the viewer where to go and where to look, and they kind of can understand the information better if it's presented in this way. So let's talk about your assignment this week. I strongly urge you to do some more research on this grid. Look online for examples of grid layouts. Wikipedia actually has a pretty good explanation of the grid and how it can be used. So look around, and there's some really good design galleries that have examples of this too. And just look anywhere. Look, like I said, look at web pages, look at magazine spreads, at newspapers, at advertisements. Pretty much anywhere you would see design, there is an underlying structure to it, and it's usually based on the grid. So, for your assignment this week, I want you to go out and find some examples of this. And what we're going to do, I want you to find 3 examples of whether it's a spread, a magazine spread, or a website, whatever, an advertisement, whatever it may be. I want you to find 3 examples that kind of utilize this grid system. And like I said, it doesn't have to be evident. It could be something that might not look like it's on the grid at all. But what I want you to do is, whenever you have these examples, whether it's a magazine, if it's a magazine, I want you to rip the page out, because you're going to scan it in, or you don't have to rip it out, but or if it's a web page, I want you to print it out. And then I want you to get a ruler and a pencil or a marker or whatever, and I want you to start drawing on it, and start creating this grid. And as you kind of draw lines around the elements in the page, you'll start to see this grid, and it'll start to make itself more and more evident as you draw lines. You'll see, and eventually, if you do enough of them, you can see the whole grid. The squares and how many columns they used and how many rows and all this. So 3 examples, and I want you to, with a marker and a ruler, draw on it, and create this grid over top of it, so you can start to recognize this in all different kinds of graphic design. So 3 examples of that. Scan it in, turn that in. The other part of the assignment is we're going to do 3 page layouts of our own. And I don't really care how you do this. You can, if you know the software, you can do it in InDesign. If not, you can cut up a magazine page, so you have columns of text and images and headlines and all that, and you can kind of rearrange them yourself. Or you can just use, you can kind of sketch it out. Like you can use a square for where an image would go, and maybe squiggly lines for where a column of text would be, something like that. You can do a rough sketch. That's okay. Or just write headline where a headline would be. But I really want you to explore creative ways to use this grid to make an interesting page layout. And the elements I want you to include in this, I want you to have a headline, a subhead, or smaller headline, 2 images, and some body text. However many columns you want that to be, how much is up to you. And you can use Latin for all I care. It doesn't have to be anything. As a matter of fact, a lot of designers use Latin when they're designing. If they want to go ahead and create the layout, but they don't have the content yet, they'll use Latin to just fill up that place so they can see what it's going to look like once the content comes. And it's called lorem ipsum, and because that's 2 Latin words that people use a lot. And there's actually a website, loremipsum.com. That's LOREMIPSUM, and that will generate Latin text for you if you want to use it that way. And you can create text boxes in Microsoft Word if you want to do it that way. But anyway, I really don't care how you do it. I just want you to explore whatever's easiest for you. I want you to explore these ways using the grid to create layouts. So 2 images, one can be large, one can be small. They can both be the same size, however you want to do it. But those are the elements. 2 images, a headline, a subhead, and some body copy. And I want you to do 3 different versions of laying that out. And get creative. We did a typography exercise where we did a page layout with different type, and I got to be honest, a lot of it was pretty plain, and a lot of it was just changing the font, making it a little bigger, but it was all still in a page, and that might be because the limitations of the software, but I really want you to kind of push the envelope on this and do some creative layouts. And just because you turn in 3 doesn't mean you should do 3. You should do a lot and then choose the best from that. Because like I said, you only get as much out of this as you put in. So that's my rant. I'll get off my soapbox now. So anyway, let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing your layouts using the grid. This is good stuff, folks. This is really putting it all together. And if you follow this kind of checklist, not necessarily the one that's in the book, but if you follow this checklist of what's the format, what's the medium, what kind of imagery should I use based on the content, and then how can I arrange things to create this visual hierarchy, to create a focal point, and where do I want people to look first. If you actually follow this process, it's a lot easier to do good design. It actually becomes harder to do bad design, because a lot of people just throw a bunch of crap on a page and are done with it. But there's a process behind it, and that's why graphic design is a specialized profession, because some people may think that some people think that everybody can design. It's like, oh, I got Microsoft Word, I can create a magazine, and yeah, you can, but it's probably going to suck. So that's why you got to understand this process behind it, so you can really start to make your design better and more thoughtful. So, all right, good luck, and I'll see you soon.